Welcome to sleepless ancient Odyssey. The day is done. It is time now to let the noise of your world fade into silence. Find your most comfortable position, and for the next few moments simply relax. Tonight's Odyssey is about to begin. Tonight, our journey takes us to the banks of the Nile in the 14th century before the Common Era. We will witness the birth of a city that should not have existed. We will walk among the followers of a heretic king who dared to reshape the divine order itself, and we will seek to understand how one man's vision created a paradise that vanished almost as suddenly as it appeared. This is not merely history. This is the story of humanity's eternal struggle between tradition and transformation, between the gods we inherit and the truths we imagine for ourselves. Whether you are here for a story to captivate your mind or a grand narrative to accompany you to sleep, your journey starts now. If you enjoy these odysseys, subscribe and join us every time we travel to the past. Now, let us begin. The child was born in the sprawling palace complex of Thebes, in a world already ancient beyond measure. Around him rose temples that had stood for 1,000 years. The great columned halls echoed with hymns to Amun-Ra, king of gods, whose priests commanded wealth beyond the dreams of common men. The infant prince arrived into this world of divine certainty with a body that would mark him as different from the warrior kings who came before. They named him Amenhotep. Amun is satisfied, the same name borne by his father, the fourth of that name, to rule the two lands of Egypt. But satisfaction was not the destiny written in the stars for this particular prince. From his earliest years, something set him apart. His frame grew tall and slender, his features elongated in ways that would puzzle historians millennia later. Some would whisper of illness, others would see divine transformation. The boy himself remained silent, watching the world with eyes that seemed to look through the present towards something only he could perceive. The Egypt of his childhood was a realm of unimaginable power. The empire stretched from the cataracts of Nubia in the south to the plains of Syria in the north. Gold flowed from the mines of the eastern desert. Tribute arrived in endless processions from vassal kingdoms who trembled at the name of pharaoh. In the great temple of Karnak, the priests of Amun grew fat on offerings, their influence seeping into every corner of the kingdom like the Nile's inundation seeping into the black earth. But young Amenhotep watched the rituals with a strange detachment. While his brothers learned the arts of war, practicing with bow and chariot in the desert heat, he lingered in the temple courtyards. He observed how the morning sun struck the pylons, how its light transformed stone to gold, how shadows fled before its presence. The priests performed their secret rites in darkened sanctuaries, carrying the hidden image of Amun through corridors where common eyes could never gaze. They spoke of the god as a mystery, as a hidden force whose true form no mortal could comprehend. And yet each morning, there it was, the sun, rising with perfect constancy over the eastern desert, flooding the world with light that required no priest to interpret, no ritual to invoke. It simply was. It gave life. It gave warmth. It made crops grow and hearts glad. The young prince began to wonder, what if the divine was not hidden at all? What if it had been there all along, obvious and glorious, obscured only by the layers of ritual and mystery that men had draped across it? These were dangerous thoughts, but princes, unlike common men, could afford to think dangerous thoughts in the silence of their own hearts. The years passed as years do. The prince grew to manhood. His father, Amenhotep III, ruled with magnificent confidence, building temples and palaces, filling the land with statues of himself in the likeness of gods. The empire basked in a golden age, and then, in a marriage that seems to have been arranged as much by destiny as by politics, the young prince was wed to a woman named Nefertiti. even her name spoke of a new beginning. Nefertiti, the beautiful one, has come. She arrived from somewhere in the court, perhaps a daughter of a powerful courtier, or perhaps from further abroad, her origins lost to the silence of ancient records. But her beauty was not lost. It would be preserved in limestone and paint, in sculptures that would make her the most recognizable face of ancient Egypt, a beauty that seems almost alien in its perfection. Together, they formed a partnership that would shake the foundations of the oldest civilization on earth. The old king died. The prince ascended the throne. He took the titles that every pharaoh before him had taken. He performed the rituals as they had been performed for millennia. For a few years, all seemed as it had always been. The priests of Amun breathed easily. The empire continued its rhythms. The Nile rose and fell. The harvest came and went. But in the private chambers of the palace, in conversations shared between husband and wife, a vision was taking shape. A vision of a new kind of Egypt. A vision of a new kind of truth. The young king looked out over his domain and saw not perfection, but corruption. He saw priests who had become princes, temples that had become treasuries, rituals that had become political theater. He saw a people separated from their gods by walls of stone and hierarchies of men. And he saw the sun, rising each morning with absolute purity, demanding nothing, giving everything, the visible, undeniable source of life itself. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV made a declaration that would echo through the centuries. He changed his name. No longer would he be Amenhotep. Amun is satisfied. From this day forward, he was Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, or perhaps the spirit of the Aten. The Aten, the sun disk, the visible manifestation of the divine, not a hidden mystery lurking in dark sanctuaries, but a blazing truth that shone down on righteous and wicked alike. And more than this, he declared something that no pharaoh had ever declared before. He proclaimed that the Aten was not merely the supreme god among many gods. The Aten was the only god. All others were false. All others were illusions. All others were the inventions of men who sought to place themselves between humanity and the divine light. The priests of Amun must have felt the ground shift beneath their feet. The nobles must have exchanged worried glances. The common people must have whispered in confusion. But Akhenaten was not finished, not nearly finished. He announced that he would build a new city, not in Thebes, where the power of Amun's priesthood had grown too entrenched to uproot, not in Memphis, the ancient capital of the Old Kingdom, but in a place that belonged to no god, claimed by no temple, untainted by tradition, a place where he could create his vision from nothing, as the Aten itself had created the world from nothing. He sent his surveyors north from Thebes, sailing down the Nile in search of the perfect site. They traveled for days through the well-known landscapes of Middle Egypt, and then they found it, a great bay in the eastern cliffs, forming a natural amphitheater, a plain of virgin sand, never before settled, never before claimed, a place where the sun rose each morning between two perfectly positioned hills, as though the landscape itself had been designed for this purpose. Here, Akhenaten declared, he would build Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, the city of light, the city of truth, the city where humanity and the divine would meet without intermediary, without deception, without the weight of the past pressing down on the present. The priests of the old gods watched from Thebes and understood that their world was ending. But on the virgin sands of Middle Egypt, another world was about to be born. The boundary stones were the first manifestations of the dream. Akhenaten ordered them carved into the cliffs that ringed his chosen plain, enormous stelae that marked the limits of his sacred domain. They can still be seen today, weathered by millennia of wind and sun, their carved reliefs showing the king and Nefertiti raising their hands in adoration of the sun disk, its rays ending in tiny hands that reached down to bestow the yank, the symbol of life, upon the royal couple. The inscriptions on these stones speak in Akhenaten's own voice, or at least the royal voice preserved for eternity in hieroglyphs. They declare that this place was chosen by the Aten itself, that no king before him had claimed it, that it would be the god's eternal seat. They promise that even if Akhenaten should die, even if his wife and daughter should die, even if catastrophe should befall them anywhere in the empire, their bodies would be brought back here to this sacred ground, to be buried in tombs cut into the eastern cliffs where the sun first touches Egypt each morning. It was a promise that would be broken, but in that 5th year of his reign, with the vision burning bright in his mind, Akhenaten could not imagine failure. He could only imagine transformation. The surveyors began their work. They stretched out their measuring cords, aligning the city's main axis with the rising sun on the winter solstice. This was not random. Every element of Akhetaten's design carried symbolic weight. The city would be oriented to the light, organized around the light, dedicated to the light. No dark sanctuaries here. No hidden holy of holies where gods dwelt in eternal darkness. The temples of the Aten would be open to the sky, their altars exposed to the direct rays of the divine. And then the workers came, not in their hundreds, but in their thousands, stone masons from the quarries of Tura and Aswan, brickmakers who would produce millions upon millions of mud bricks, carpenters, painters, sculptors, laborers. They arrived with their families, settling in workers' villages on the outskirts of what would become the city. The desert came alive with activity. The sound of mallets on stone echoed across the plain. The smoke of brick kilns hazed the air. For a city built in such haste, Akhetaten's ambition was breathtaking. The royal palace stretched for over 300 meters along the river's edge, its countless rooms and courtyards designed to house not just the king, but the entire apparatus of government. A bridge, the Great Bridge, would span the royal road, connecting the palace's private quarters to the state apartments. Through this bridge, the king and queen would process each day, visible to their people, bathed in the light of the Aten. The great temple of the Aten rose in the heart of the city, utterly unlike any temple Egypt had known. Traditional temples were journeys into darkness, their halls growing progressively smaller and dimmer until one reached the sacred sanctuary. But the great temple was a journey into light. Its courtyards were vast and open. Its hundreds of offering tables lay exposed to the sun. Here, at dawn and dusk, the king himself would make offerings, not to a hidden image, but to the visible orb of the sun as it climbed the sky or descended toward the western desert. Beside the great temple, they built the small temple, the mansion of the Aten, more intimate, perhaps dedicated more specifically to Nefertiti's devotions. They constructed administrative buildings where scribes recorded the empire's business. They laid out residential districts where the nobility would build their villas with gardens and pools, stables and storage rooms. They planned workshops where artists would create a new kind of art, breaking free from the rigid conventions that had governed Egyptian aesthetics for thousands of years. And everywhere, on every wall, in every relief, the same image repeated, the sun disk with its radiating rays, each ending in a hand, bestowing life, bestowing light, bestowing truth. Beneath the disk, the royal family, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters, shone not in the stiff, formal poses of traditional kingship, but in moments of domestic intimacy. The king kissing his daughter, the queen holding a child on her lap, the family dining together, playing together, living together beneath the blessing of the Aten. This too was revolutionary. Pharaohs had always been shown as distant, godlike, untouchable. But Akhenaten portrayed himself as human, as a father, as a husband. Some historians see in this a humanizing impulse, a desire to make the divine accessible. Others see something more unsettling, a king who placed himself and his family at the center of religious devotion, making the worship of the Aten inseparable from the worship of Akhenaten himself. Perhaps both views hold truth. Perhaps Akhenaten genuinely believed that by showing his own humanity, his own devotion, his own joy in the god's blessing, he could teach his people a new way of seeing the divine. Or perhaps, in declaring all other gods false, he created a vacuum that only he could fill. The old temples had had their priesthoods, their intermediaries, but in the religion of the Aten, there was only one priest who truly mattered, the king himself. The city rose with astonishing speed. Within 2 years, enough had been built that Akhenaten and his court could relocate from Thebes. They came in a great procession, sailing north on the Nile, leaving behind the ancient capital with its towering temples and accumulated centuries. They arrived at Akhetaten like pioneers arriving at a promised land, like the Israelites entering Canaan, like any people who have convinced themselves that by changing their place they can change their nature. The city must have been glorious in those early years. Imagine sailing past it on the river at dawn. The sun breaks over the eastern cliffs, flooding the plain with golden light. The white limestone of the temples glows like beacons. The painted walls of the palace shimmer with color. The gardens are green with newly planted trees, watered from the river by channels and pools. The streets are clean, unmarked by the wear of centuries. Everything is new. Everything is possible. In the workshops, artists were creating a new aesthetic under the king's direct patronage. The rigid conventions of Egyptian art, which had remained essentially unchanged for 1500 years, were being overturned. Human figures were shown with elongated skulls, full lips, narrow waists, and prominent bellies. The royal family was depicted with these exaggerated features to an extreme degree. Some scholars believe this reflected Akhenaten's actual physical appearance, perhaps the result of a genetic condition. Others argue it was purely symbolic, a way of showing that the king and his family had been transformed by their devotion to the Aten, that they had become something more than merely human. Whatever the truth, the art of Amarna, as scholars now call it, was unlike anything Egypt had produced before. It had fluidity, it had movement, it captured moments rather than eternal tableaux. It showed emotion on faces, affection in gestures, life in all its messy, beautiful complexity. Even today, when you stand before the painted bust of Nefertiti in Berlin, you feel you are looking at a real woman, not a divine icon. Her gaze is direct, her beauty startling, her presence immediate. The workshops produced these images by the thousands. Sculptors carved them in limestone and sandstone. Painters recreated them on plaster walls. The same scenes repeated throughout the city. The royal family at worship, the sun disk radiating its blessings, the king and queen in their chariots, the princesses playing with their toys, holding sistrums, sitting at their parents' feet. And beyond the royal images, there were scenes of daily life more vivid than anything Egyptian art had shown before. Cattle being driven, tribute arriving from foreign lands, officials bowing before the king, musicians playing, servants working. The whole spectrum of life in this new city, all of it suffused with the light of the Aten, all of it part of the grand vision. But as the buildings rose and the population swelled, practical problems emerged. Akhetaten was not situated at a natural crossroads. It had no strategic importance. It existed solely because Akhenaten had declared it should exist. Supplying it required constant effort. Food had to be imported. Water came from the Nile and from a few desert wells, never quite enough for the city's needs. The location, while symbolically perfect with its natural amphitheater of cliffs, was exposed to harsh desert winds. Sandstorms could sweep across the plain, coating everything in grit. And there was a deeper problem, one that would only become apparent with time. Akhenaten had created a city dedicated to his vision of truth, but truth, as it turned out, was not enough to hold an empire together. While the king devoted himself to worship and artistic patronage in his new capital, the machinery of imperial administration began to falter. The vassal kingdoms in Syria and Canaan, which had paid tribute to Egypt for generations, sensed weakness. They began to withhold their payments. They formed alliances without Egyptian approval. They appealed to the pharaoh for military support against rival kingdoms, and their letters went unanswered. These letters survive. They were found in Akhetaten's ruins, an archive of clay tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the age. They are desperate, pleading, sometimes angry. "Why does my lord the king not answer?" they ask. "Why do you abandon your servants?" They speak of cities falling, of territories lost, of promises broken, and from Akhetaten, it seems, there came only silence. Akhenaten was not a warrior king. He had no interest in the military glory that his ancestors had pursued. His concerns were spiritual, artistic, domestic. He appears in no battle scenes. There are no inscriptions boasting of enemies crushed or cities conquered. Instead, there are endless images of him worshipping the Aten, of his family at peace beneath the sun's rays, of a world that existed only within the boundaries of his city. The priests of Amun, exiled from their power, watched from Thebes. The generals, starved of attention and resources, grew restless. The nobles, forced to uproot their lives and build new houses in an untested city, must have wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. But still, for a few years, the vision held. Still, the artists created their masterpieces. Still, the sun rose each morning over the eastern cliffs and blessed the city that should not have existed. Still, for a little while longer, Akhenaten's dream survived. To understand what was lost when Akhetaten fell, we must understand what it was like to live there in its brief flowering. The city at its height held perhaps 20,000 souls, perhaps more. Not as vast as Thebes or Memphis, but substantial, a complete urban ecosystem compressed into a few kilometers along the Nile's eastern bank. The elite lived in villas in the northern and southern suburbs, grand houses surrounded by walls, with courtyards and gardens, wells and granaries. These homes have been excavated, their ground plans revealed, and they speak of comfortable lives. The main halls were high-ceilinged, designed to catch the breeze. Walls were plastered and painted with scenes of nature, marshlands with birds and fish, gardens with flowering plants, decorative patterns in ochre and blue. Floors were sometimes painted too, designed to look like pools of water where one might symbolically wade. Each villa was a self-contained estate. There were kitchens with bread ovens and cooking fires, storage rooms for grain and oil and wine, stables for donkeys and cattle, servants' quarters, guest rooms. Some houses had private chapels, shrines to the Aten where the family could make their devotions. The wealthiest had private tombs being cut into the cliffs for the day when they would join the ancestors. The nobles who lived in these houses had followed their king from Thebes, abandoning properties and positions that had belonged to their families for generations. They included men like Ai, the powerful courtier who may have been Nefertiti's father, who would later become pharaoh himself. There was Mahu, the chief of police, responsible for keeping order in the new city. Nakht, the vizier, who managed the daily business of government. Panehesi, the first servant of the Aten, the closest thing the new religion had to a high priest. These men decorated the walls of their tombs with scenes of their service to Akhenaten. Unlike traditional Egyptian tomb art, which focused on the afterlife and the journey of the soul through the underworld, Amarna tomb art focused on life, on the rewards and honors bestowed by the king. The nobles are shown receiving gold collars, being promoted in rank, being praised before the court. The king appears again and again, always with Nefertiti at his side, always beneath the rays of the Aten. The hymns carved in these tombs preserve the theology of Atenism in its most developed form. The most famous is the great hymn to the Aten, found in the tomb of Ai. Scholars have noted its striking similarity to Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible, though whether there was any actual connection remains debated. The hymn praises the Aten as the creator of all life, present in every land, caring for all creatures great and small. It celebrates the god's daily rebirth at dawn, its journey across the sky, its descent into darkness only to rise again renewed. How manifold it is, what you have made, the hymn proclaims. You create the earth according to your desire. Every land, every person, the cattle, the birds, all of them you have made. You set every person in their place. You supply their needs. It is a beautiful vision, a God of light and life, accessible to all, playing no favorites among nations or classes. A God whose presence was undeniable because it could be seen every day, warming the earth, making crops grow, giving joy to children and animals alike. In many ways, it was a more sophisticated theology than what had come before, more universal in its implications, more focused on the natural world rather than the supernatural. But theology alone does not feed families or secure borders. And in the workman's village to the east of the city, life was harder than it was in the nobles' villas. The workers who built and maintained Akhetaten lived in a walled community of small, uniform houses. These structures have been extensively excavated, revealing the daily life of ordinary Egyptians with unusual clarity. The houses were tiny by modern standards, just a few rooms, built of mud brick. They had small shrines in the main room where families kept images of household gods, protective deities like Bes and Taweret, gods of childbirth and good fortune. Interestingly, these personal gods do not seem to have been suppressed by Akhenaten's religious revolution. In the private sphere, people still called on the old protectors. The excavations of the workman's village have yielded poignant details: small toys for children, cosmetic vessels, jewelry of faience and glazed pottery, letters written on broken pottery shards, the ancient equivalent of scrap paper. These letters speak of ordinary concerns: wages owed, food shortages, family disputes, romantic entanglements. They remind us that for most people living in Akhetaten, the king's religious vision was probably less important than the price of grain and the reliability of their water supply. And the water supply was a constant challenge. The city depended on the Nile and on wells dug into the desert substrate. But desert wells are brackish, unpleasant to drink. Water had to be carried from the river, stored in large jars, carefully rationed. In the summer heat, before the inundation, water became precious. The wealthy could afford servants to carry it in abundance. The poor made do with less. Food was also a concern. The farmland around Akhetaten was limited. Most provisions had to be imported, either from royal estates elsewhere in Egypt or as tax payments from the provinces. The city's granaries had to be kept full. The bakers had to produce enough bread, the brewers enough beer, to feed 20,000 mouths. When the administration functioned well, this happened. When it faltered, people went hungry. There is evidence of both prosperity and hardship in the archaeological record. Some graves show signs of good nutrition, of people who ate meat and fish, vegetables and fruit. Others show signs of malnutrition, of diseases linked to poverty. Egypt was never an egalitarian society. It was a hierarchical civilization where the pharaoh stood at the apex of a pyramid of privilege. Akhenaten's spiritual revolution did nothing to change this fundamental structure. The nobility still lived in comfort while the workers labored in the sun. But there were moments of shared joy, moments when the entire city came together. Religious festivals were among these. On certain days, The king and queen would process through the city in their great chariot, gold and electrum gleaming, accompanied by chanting priests and musicians. The people would line the streets to watch, to receive the blessing of the royal presence. The king might stop to distribute gold to favored courtiers, a public display of royal favor that strengthened the bonds of loyalty. There were festivals celebrating the Aten's daily journey, festivals marking the seasons, festivals honoring the royal family. On these occasions, the great temple courtyard would fill with offerings, bread and beer, meat and fowl, wine and milk, incense and flowers. The smoke of burning incense would rise into the clear desert air. The sound of sistrums and harps would echo off the cliffs. For a few hours the vision seemed real. The city of light seemed eternal. And then there were the private moments, the ones that don't make it into official inscriptions, but that archaeologists can sometimes glimpse. A child's toy dropped in a courtyard, a love letter scratched on pottery, a bit of jewelry carefully buried beneath a floor, perhaps hidden against theft, or perhaps an offering to ensure the house's protection. These small traces remind us that Akhetaten, for all its ideological baggage, was also just a place where people lived, where they fell in love and had children, where they gossiped with neighbors, where they worried about money and celebrated small victories. In the palace, Nefertiti seems to have played an unusually prominent role. She appears in inscriptions and reliefs performing rituals that were traditionally the king's alone. Some scenes show her smiting enemies, a pose normally reserved for male pharaohs. Others show her making offerings to the Aten without Akhenaten present. There is evidence that she may have served as co-regent, that she wielded real political power rather than simply ceremonial status. The royal couple had 6 daughters, no sons, which must have been a source of anxiety in a culture that valued male heirs. The girls were named Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankesenpaten, Neferneferuaten, Tasherit, Neferneferure, and Setepenre. They appear constantly in the art of Amarna, playing, worshipping with their parents, sitting in family scenes of remarkable intimacy. In the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, tragedy struck. Meketaten, the second daughter, died. She may have died in childbirth, despite her youth, a victim of an early marriage to her own father or to another relative, as was not uncommon in the royal family. Meketaten's death was depicted in her parents' tomb, one of the few scenes of mourning in Amarna art. The king and queen are shown bent in grief, their postures conveying genuine emotion. It is a reminder that despite the grand vision, despite the religious revolution, the royal family was subject to the same sorrows as any family. Death came for them as it came for everyone. The Aten's blessing did not protect against disease or the dangers of childbirth. Not long after Meketaten's death, Nefertiti disappears from the historical record. Some scholars believe she died, others argue she changed her name and continued to rule as co-regent. Still others suggest she fell from favor, exiled or marginalized for reasons we can only guess at. Her fate remains one of Egyptology's enduring mysteries. What we do know is that in the later years of Akhenaten's reign, the city began to show signs of strain. Fewer monuments were completed. Some projects seem to have been abandoned, half-finished. The flow of tribute from the empire's vassal states slowed to a trickle. In the wider world, Egypt's influence was waning. The great power that had dominated the Near East for centuries was turning inward, obsessed with its internal transformation, neglecting the practical requirements of empire. And in Thebes, in Memphis, in the provincial centers scattered throughout Egypt, the priests of the old gods waited. They had been stripped of power, forbidden to practice their ancient rites, but they had not disappeared. They maintained their knowledge, preserved their rituals in secret, and waited for the day when the heresy would end. That day was coming, faster than anyone in Akhetaten could have imagined. Akhenaten ruled for 17 years. Perhaps a few more, the chronology remains uncertain, but by any measure his reign was brief, and the last years were marked by gathering shadows. The king, who had seemed so vital in the early images, so confident in his revolutionary vision, appears in later reliefs as older, more drawn, perhaps sick. The political situation beyond Egypt's borders deteriorated steadily. The Amarna letters, those clay tablets written by vassal kings and governors, paint a picture of a crumbling imperial structure. The kingdom of Mitanni, once Egypt's ally, was being overrun by the rising power of the Hittites. The city-states of Canaan were caught between competing powers, playing them off against each other, with Egypt increasingly irrelevant to their calculations. In Amurru, a prince named Aziru paid lip service to Egyptian authority while secretly corresponding with the Hittite king, eventually switching sides entirely. From Jerusalem, a governor named Abdi Heba wrote desperate letters to the pharaoh. "Why do you not respond to my letters?" he asked. "If you send no troops this year, all the lands of the king will be lost." From Byblos, from Tyre, from Damascus, similar pleas arrived at Akhetaten, and from Akhetaten, the responses, when they came at all, were vague and unhelpful. It is possible that Akhenaten simply did not care. His concern was with spiritual truth, not with the crude business of imperial administration. It is also possible that he did care, but lacked the resources to respond effectively. Building Akhetaten had been enormously expensive. The traditional power structures that had managed Egypt's foreign policy for centuries had been disrupted. The military, starved of attention and perhaps demoralized by a king who showed no interest in martial glory, may have been ill-prepared for sustained campaigns abroad. Within Egypt itself, resentment must have been building. The people, by and large, had not asked for a religious revolution. The old gods had served them well for thousands of years. Osiris and Isis, Horus and Hathor, Anubis and Thoth. These were not abstract theological concepts. They were intimate presences in people's lives, protectors and guides, deities you could appeal to in times of trouble. The Aten was distant by comparison, vast and impersonal, a cosmic force that might care for the world in general but seemed unconcerned with individual suffering, and the practical effects of the religious changes were disruptive. The great temples had been economic engines, employing thousands of people, distributing food and goods, maintaining schools and scriptoria. When Akhenaten closed the temples and redirected their resources to Akhetaten, those economic networks were shattered. People lost their livelihoods. Communities that had revolved around temple festivals and religious calendars found themselves adrift. The priests, especially, had reason to hate Akhenaten. He had not just challenged their theology. He had destroyed their power, their wealth, their very reason for existence. They had been mediators between humanity and the divine, the keepers of sacred knowledge, the performers of rituals that maintained cosmic order. Now they were told that all of it had been a lie, that their centuries of service had been meaningless, that a simple man could worship the Aten directly without needing their intercession. Some priests may have accepted the new theology, but many must have rejected it, maintaining their old beliefs in private, teaching them to their children, waiting for the moment when they could restore what had been lost. They were patient, they were organized, they had resources hidden away, and they had one enormous advantage. They represented continuity with 3,000 years of Egyptian tradition, while Akhenaten represented a rupture, an anomaly, a historical aberration. In the 17th year of his reign, or perhaps the 18th, Akhenaten died. The circumstances of his death are unknown. There is no evidence of violence, no suggestion of assassination, though the possibility cannot be ruled out. He may have died of natural causes, succumbing to whatever condition gave him his unusual appearance. He was perhaps in his early 40s, not old by modern standards, but mortality rates were high in ancient Egypt, even for the wealthy. He was buried in the royal tomb cut into the cliffs east of Akhetaten, in the same tomb complex where his daughter Akhetaten already rested. The tomb was not finished. Many of its reliefs were left incomplete, rough outlines that would never be carved into their final forms. This suggests that his death came suddenly, without the long preparation that normally preceded a royal burial. And then things moved quickly, very quickly. A shadowy figure named Smenkhkare appears briefly in the record, ruling for perhaps a year or two as co-regent or successor. Some scholars believe Smenkhkare was actually Nefertiti ruling under a male name. Others think he was a son or brother of Akhenaten. The evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, frustratingly incomplete. What we know is that Smenkkare's reign, if it can be called that, was brief and accomplished nothing of note. After Smenkhkare came Tutankhaten, a boy of perhaps 8 or 9 years old. He was likely Akhenaten's son, possibly by a lesser wife named Kia, though his parentage is debated. What is certain is that he was far too young to rule in his own right. Effective power lay with the regent, the courtier Ai, and with the general Horemheb, commander of the army. These men were pragmatists. They understood that Egypt could not continue on Akhenaten's path. The experiment had failed. The empire was weakening. The people were restless. The time had come for restoration. Within a few years of Akhenaten's death, the boy king changed his name. No longer Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, but Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. It was a declaration. The old gods were returning. The temples would be reopened. The priests would be restored to their positions. Egypt would return to what it had been before the heretic king disrupted the divine order. A decree was issued, inscribed on a stone stela that would become known as the Restoration Stela. It described the state of Egypt under Akhenaten in the darkest terms. The temples had been in ruins, it claimed, the shrines overgrown with weeds. The gods had turned their backs on Egypt. When the army went forth to campaign in the Levant, it met with no success. When people prayed to the gods for guidance, the gods did not answer. All of this, the stela implied, was the result of Akhenaten's heresy. But now the young king was setting things right. The temples would be rebuilt, more magnificent than before. The priesthoods would be restored. The festivals would be reinstated. Amun, the king of gods, would once again receive his due worship. Order would be restored. Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth and balance and justice that had governed Egypt for millennia, would prevail once more. And Akhetaten, the city of light, the horizon of the Aten, it was abandoned, not immediately, but within a decade of Akhenaten's death. The court returned to Thebes. The nobles dismantled their villas, salvaging what materials they could. The workshops fell silent. The temples were stripped of their treasures. The palace, which had housed the apparatus of government, was emptied of its records and furnishings. The workers' village was abandoned last. The people who had lived there, who had built the city with their own hands, packed up their belongings and left. Perhaps some stayed in the area, eking out a living from fishing and farming. But the city itself was dead. The desert, which had been held at bay for 20 years through constant effort, began to reclaim the plain. Sand drifted into the streets. Without maintenance, the mud brick walls began to erode. The painted plaster flaked away from the walls. The gardens, deprived of water, withered and died. Later, king lists would simply skip from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as though Akhenaten had never existed. The mud bricks crumbled, but the stone foundations remained. A tomb of a dream, a tomb of a vision that had tried to change the world and failed. Young Tutankhamun ruled for about 9 years before dying at approximately 18 years of age. Modern CT scans of his mummy suggest he suffered from multiple health problems: a clubfoot, a cleft palate, possibly genetic disorders resulting from generations of royal inbreeding. He was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a tomb not originally intended for him, hastily prepared because his death came unexpectedly. Whispers survive in the shadows of temples, and there is evidence that some aspects of Akhenaten's revolution left permanent marks. The art of the post-Amarna period never quite returned to the rigid formalism of the pre-Akhenaten era. Some fluidity remained, some humanity. The faces in reliefs showed more emotion. The poses were less stiff. It was as though Egyptian artists, having glimpsed a different way of seeing, could not entirely unsee it. Akhenaten proclaimed a single universal God. In a world where priests controlled access to the divine, Akhenaten suggested that any person could have a direct relationship with the sacred. In a world where tradition was sacred, where the wisdom of the ancestors was unquestioned, Akhenaten dared to say that perhaps the ancestors had been wrong. Within a generation, it was as though he had never existed, and the old gods, far from being weakened by their brief exile, returned stronger than ever. Akhenaten's experiment reveals something about the limits of top-down social engineering, about the danger of imposing radical change without building popular support, about the resilience of traditional beliefs and institutions. He had the courage to break with the past, but not the skill to build a sustainable future. And so his city stands, or rather doesn't stand, as a monument to ambition and failure, to dreams and disappointments, to the eternal human struggle between what is and what might be. But no one remembered what the city had been, what it had meant, why it had been built in such a strange location far from Egypt's traditional centers of power. Then, in the late 18th century, European travelers began to explore Egypt with new eyes. The age of Egyptology was beginning. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 brought with it scholars and artists who documented the ancient monuments with unprecedented detail. And among the places they visited was this strange site on the east bank of the Nile, with its enigmatic boundaries steely carved into the cliffs. But it was not until the late 19th century that serious excavation began. In 1887, a local woman searching for sebach, the nitrogen-rich ancient mud used as fertilizer, stumbled upon a cache of clay tablets at Tel El Amarna. They were initially dismissed as forgeries because nothing like them had been found before in Egypt, but gradually scholars realized their significance. They were genuine, they were written in Akkadian cuneiform, and they opened a window into a period of Egyptian history that had been deliberately obscured. The race was on to excavate the site before it was destroyed by looters and farmers. In the early 20th century, the Egypt Exploration Society began systematic excavations under the direction of archaeologists like Flinders Petrie and Leonard Woolley. They uncovered the workers' village with its remarkably preserved houses and artifacts. They excavated the Great Temple and the palace complex. They found the workshops where artists had created the distinctive Amarna style. And in 1912, in the workshop of the chief sculptor Thutmose, German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt made a discovery that would change how the world viewed ancient Egypt. Buried in the debris was a painted limestone bust of a woman wearing a tall blue crown. Her face was perfectly preserved, her features refined and elegant, her gaze direct and compelling. It was Nefertiti. The bust was transported to Germany, where it eventually became one of the most visited artworks in the world. Egyptian authorities have repeatedly requested its return, arguing that it was illegally exported. Germany has refused, claiming the export was legitimate under the laws of the time. The dispute continues to this day. But whatever the legal and ethical arguments, the bust accomplished something remarkable. It made Nefertiti, and by extension the Amarna period, into icons of popular culture. Millions of people who know little else about ancient Egypt recognize her face. Throughout the 20th century, excavations at Amarna continued, revealing more and more about the city's brief life. The British archaeologist Barry Kemp has led excavations there since the 1970s, applying modern archaeological techniques to uncover details about daily life, social organization, and urban planning. His work has shown that far from being just a royal fantasy, Akhetaten was a functioning city with complex social structures, economic systems, and administrative hierarchies. DNA analysis of royal mummies has shed new light on the family relationships of the Amarna period, though it has also raised new questions. Tutankhamun's parents were almost certainly full siblings, which helps explain his various health problems. But the exact relationships among Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their various possible children remain debated. The science has answered some questions while opening others. Modern scholars have offered various interpretations of Akhenaten's motivations and achievements. Some see him as a visionary, a proto-monotheist, who anticipated later religious developments. Others see him as a narcissist who used religion to consolidate his own power. Some view him as a tragic figure, a man whose genuine spiritual insights were undermined by political naivete. Others see him as a tyrant whose authoritarian imposition of religious change caused unnecessary suffering. There is probably truth in all of these views. Akhenaten was complex, as all human beings are complex. He was capable of genuine devotion and of ruthless suppression. He created sublime art and caused real hardship. He challenged the status quo in ways that were intellectually courageous and politically catastrophic. He was both more and less than the simple labels of heretic or visionary suggest. What makes his story compelling is not that it offers easy answers, but that it raises enduring questions. Questions about the relationship between individual vision and collective tradition, about the limits of top-down change, about the role of religion in society, about the tension between material power and spiritual truth, about the price of innovation and the cost of failure. And there is something hauntingly modern about Akhenaten's experiment. His attempt to replace a complex religious system with a simplified, rationalized alternative mirrors many later attempts to engineer society according to abstract principles. His emphasis on personal devotion over institutional ritual resonates with certain strands of Protestant Christianity and modern spirituality. His artistic revolution, rejecting established conventions in favor of naturalism and emotional honesty, anticipates later artistic movements. Even his failure feels modern. The idealistic leader who overreaches, who tries to change too much too quickly, who discovers that reality is more resistant to transformation than theory suggests. The ruins of Akhetaten speak to us across the millennia, not because they represent success, but because they represent a particular kind of failure, the failure of vision to overcome the weight of history, the failure of one man's truth to become a civilization's truth, the failure of light to banish all shadows. These are failures we recognize because we have seen them repeated throughout history. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Cultural Revolution, the Arab Spring, each began with visions of radical transformation, of sweeping away the corrupt old order to build something pure and new. Each discovered that the old order, whatever its flaws, contained accumulated knowledge and social structures that could not simply be discarded without cost. And yet we keep trying. We keep imagining alternatives to the given order. We keep believing that perhaps this time, with enough conviction and enough courage, we can build the city of light that will endure. This too is deeply human, the capacity for vision, for imagination, for refusing to accept the world as it is. This is what drives progress, even as it sometimes drives us over cliffs. Akhenaten's city lasted barely 20 years, but its memory has lasted more than 3,000. That itself is a kind of immortality, though not the kind he would have wanted. He wanted his city to stand forever, a monument to the Aten and to the truth he had discovered. Instead, it became a monument to ambition, to failure, and to the stubborn persistence of memory even when officially suppressed. The sun still rises over the cliffs of Amarna. Each morning, as it has for millions of years, it breaks the horizon and floods the plain with light. The light that Akhenaten worshipped, the light that he believed was the visible face of God, the light that continues, indifferent to human dreams and human failures, giving life, giving warmth, asking nothing in return. The ruins lie scattered across the sand. Enough remains to trace the city's outline, to understand its layout, to imagine what it might have been like to walk its streets when they were new. But it requires imagination now. The palaces are foundations, the temples are ground plans, the gardens are desert scrub, the pools that once reflected the sky are filled with sand, and yet something persists. Call it memory, call it presence, call it the ghost of a dream. When you stand among the ruins at dawn, with the sun breaking over the eastern cliffs, just as it did when Akhenaten first saw this place and declared it sacred, you can feel something of what he must have felt. The power of the light, the beauty of the landscape, the possibility inherent in an empty space, waiting to be filled with vision. Perhaps that is why we keep returning to this story. Not because Akhenaten succeeded, but because he tried. Not because his vision endured, but because he had a vision at all. In a world dominated by tradition, by the authority of the past, by the power of established institutions, he dared to imagine something different. He dared to look at the sun and see God. He dared to believe that truth could be simple, accessible, undeniable. He dared to think that one person, even a king, could change the entire direction of a civilization. He was wrong, or at least he was unsuccessful. But his wrongness, his failure, teaches us something that success never could. It teaches us about limits, about the importance of working with human nature rather than against it, about the value of what has been tested by time, about the need for wisdom to temper vision, for patience to complement courage, for respect to moderate revolutionary zeal. The priests of Amun, in their restoration, claimed they were returning Ma'at to Egypt. Ma'at, that central Egyptian concept of truth, justice, balance, cosmic order. They claimed that Akhenaten had disrupted Ma'at, had thrown the world into chaos. And in their terms, perhaps they were right. But Akhenaten too claimed to serve truth, a different kind of truth, a simpler truth, a truth that required no priesthood to interpret. Both sides claimed truth. Both sides claimed to be restoring order. Perhaps the real lesson is that truth is not simple, that order requires more than individual conviction, that civilization is built slowly, over generations, through trial and error, through the gradual accumulation of practices that work. That radical change, however well-intentioned, usually fails unless it resonates with something deep in the culture it seeks to transform. And yet, knowing this, we will continue to dream. We will continue to build our cities of light in the desert. We will continue to believe that perhaps this time, with this vision, with this leader, with this revolutionary insight, we can finally get it right. We will continue to fail, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the dream itself is valuable even when it doesn't come true. Perhaps the attempt matters even when it ends in ruins. The Aten, Akhenaten's god, was real in a way that many gods are not. The sun exists. Its power is not metaphorical. It does give life. It does dispel darkness. Akhenaten was not wrong about this. He was only wrong in thinking that this simple truth could replace the complex web of meanings and practices that had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. He was wrong in thinking that what was true for him must be true for everyone. He was wrong in imposing his vision rather than inviting others to share it. But he was not wrong to look at the sun and feel awe. He was not wrong to seek direct experience of the divine rather than accepting second-hand interpretations. He was not wrong to question tradition, to challenge authority, to imagine alternatives. These impulses, when balanced with wisdom and humility, are sources of renewal. When unbalanced, they lead to Akhetaten, a beautiful dream that becomes a cautionary tale. The desert preserves everything and destroys everything. It preserved the ruins of Akhetaten just enough for us to know what was lost. It destroyed them just enough that we must use imagination to reconstruct what was. This seems fitting. Memory works the same way. We remember just enough to learn. We forget just enough to try again. Somewhere in the desert, beneath the sand, undiscovered artifacts still lie buried. A fragment of painted plaster showing the royal family at worship. A letter on papyrus that didn't survive the moisture but left its impression in the soil. A child's toy dropped in a courtyard 3,000 years ago and waiting still to be found. Each discovery adds a detail to the picture, never quite completing it, always leaving room for mystery, for interpretation, for imagination. This is how history works. This is how memory works. We piece together what we can from fragments and ruins, from texts and artifacts, from the evidence of stones and bones. We construct narratives that try to make sense of what people did and why they did it. We know we're partly wrong, that we're projecting our own concerns onto the past, that we're filling gaps with speculation, but we try anyway, because understanding the past is part of understanding ourselves. Akhenaten tried to create a world where everything was clear, where truth was obvious, where the divine presence was undeniable. He failed. The world remains mysterious. Truth remains elusive. The divine, if it exists, remains hidden in the same way it always has, obscured by conflicting interpretations, by human limitation, by the simple fact that we see through a glass darkly and understand only in part. But for 20 years, in a city built on virgin sand beneath the cliffs of Middle Egypt, people lived as though the mystery had been solved. They woke each morning to the sun breaking over the eastern horizon. They went to work in temples open to the sky. They raised their hands in prayer toward a God they could see with their own eyes. They believed, perhaps, that they were living in a new age, that the old darkness had been dispelled forever. They were wrong. The darkness returned. The old gods returned. The city was abandoned. The desert reclaimed the plain. But for those 20 years, the dream was real, the vision lived, the city of light stood shining beside the Nile. And now, 3,000 years later, when we stand among the ruins and watch the sun rise over the cliffs, we can still feel an echo of that dream, still imagine what it might have been like, still wonder what might have happened if the vision had succeeded, if Akhenaten had lived longer, if Nefertiti had remained by his side, if the empire had held together, if the people had embraced the new god, if the priests had accepted their displacement, if history had turned differently, but history turned the way it turned. The city fell, the dream died, and all that remains is light and sand and stone and the memory of a king who dared to believe that he could change the world. The sun rises, the sun sets, the cycle continues, and we, standing in the ruins, looking at the fragments of what was, continue to dream our own dreams, build our own cities, imagine our own transformations, learning from the past, repeating its mistakes, carrying forward its hopes. This is the human story. This is what we do. This is who we are. And the sun, indifferent and eternal, continues to rise over the eastern cliffs, flooding the world with light, asking nothing, giving everything, just as it did when Akhenaten first saw it and believed he had found God. The journey is complete. The story is told, and yet it is never complete, never fully told, because every generation must grapple with the questions Akhenaten raised. Every generation must find its own balance between tradition and transformation. Every generation must decide what truths are worth preserving and what visions are worth pursuing. And perhaps in the end, that is the greatest legacy of the lost city of Akhetaten. Not answers, but questions. Not certainty, but wonder. Not a blueprint for success, but a meditation on ambition, failure, and the enduring human need to believe that tomorrow might be different from today. The day is done. The Odyssey is complete. And whether you stayed with this journey through all its turns, or whether it accompanied you into sleep, the sun will rise again tomorrow over the ruins of dreams, both ancient and modern. Rest now. Let the story settle into memory. Let the lessons filter into your understanding. And tomorrow, when you wake, the world will still be filled with light and shadow, with certainty and mystery, with the tension between what is and what might be, as it always has been, as it always will be. Until we meet again, may you rest well. May your own dreams be vivid and meaningful, and may the light, whatever form it takes in your life, guide you toward truth without blinding you to wisdom. Good night.